She called me
I
on
need
a
you to
Thursday
pretend to be
morning
my
at
husband
8:47 and
for the
said,
custody hearing.
"Connor told the judge he
Pretend
wants you to
your
be his
husband.
real
I don't
father."
understand.
I was at
It's
my
my
desk
daughter.
in the architectural
Please
office
consider
on South Main Street with a set of drawings open in front of me and a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I set down my pencil. I said, "Say that again." Melissa said, "He had a
Please,
private
Judge,
meeting with
make him
Judge
my
Gould the
real
week
dad."
before the
Order in the
hearing.
court. Let
The
the boy
judge
speak.
asks to meet with children in contested custody cases. Standard procedure in Shelby County. I told Connor he could say whatever he wanted to say. I said, and he said that. She said, he said he wanted to live with me. He said the things you would expect a 9-year-old to say about why he wanted to live with his mother. And then he said he wanted you to be his real father. For real. Not just for school stuff. I looked at the drawings on my desk. A 1924 commercial building in the South Main Arts District, brick exterior, decorative terracotta cornice, the specific quality of a structure that had been built to matter and that had been waiting 100 years for someone to treat it accordingly. I had been assessing it since August. The assessment had been the reason I had met Melissa Harte. The assessment had not been the reason I had spent 10 weeks attending baseball games and school events and Tuesday evening dinners. I said, "What did the judge say?" She said, "She asked him to tell her about you." I said, "What did he say?" There was a pause on the line. She said, "I'll tell you, but first I need to tell you something else." I said, "Okay." She said, "When I asked you to do this, the arrangement, I told myself it was for the custody case. That was true. It was also not the complete truth." The office was quiet. South Main Street on a November morning, the specific quality of Memphis in late autumn, the light doing what it did in that part of the city when the heat had finally released its grip. I said, "What's the complete truth?" She said, "I had watched you work for 3 weeks. I had been looking for a reason to spend more time around you. The custody case was the reason I told myself was acceptable." I did not say anything. She said, "Connor is 9 years old, and he told a judge what I have been not telling you for 10 weeks. I said, "He told me too." She said, "What?" I said, "In week 5. He asked me if I liked you as a friend or the other kind." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What did you say?" I said you were a remarkable person." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "I know. I was working on telling you." She said, "Nick." I said, "Yes." She said, "Connor is going to be very pleased with himself." I said, "He should be." I looked at the drawings again. The building, the assessment. The 10 weeks that had started as professional work and had become something that had no professional name. "He had more courage than either of us." She said, "Yes, he did." Let me tell you how a 9-year-old ended up saying that to a judge, and what I understood, by the time he said it, about what paying attention to the right things actually means. I grew up in Memphis. My father left when I was 9 years old. Not dramatically, he did not leave in the night without warning. He and my mother, Frances, had been separating for a year before the formal separation, the specific, slow unwinding of a marriage that had become something different from what both people had intended. And by the time the custody proceeding happened, I had understood for a long time that the family was changing shape. What I had not understood was that the custody proceeding would be the thing where nobody asked me what I wanted. I was 9 years old. The attorneys were adults. The judge was an adult. My parents were adults. I sat in the waiting room while the adults decided what was going to happen to me, and nobody asked me what I thought about it, which was not because they were cruel. They were not cruel, but because the specific logic of the legal system at that time and in that place was that children were objects of custody decisions rather than participants in them. My mother got custody. This was the right outcome. Not because my father was a bad person, he was not, but because my mother was the parent who knew things about me that the other parent did not know, and the judge never found out this distinction existed because nobody asked me. I had carried this for 30 years. When Melissa Harte had told me about Connor and the custody case and what Robert Ames had said about domestic stability, I had heard the story through the specific filter of being the 9-year-old in the waiting room. I had said I needed to think about it. I had thought about Connor in the corner of the open plan office doing his homework on Tuesdays, the specific self-contained quality of a child who had learned to occupy space without requiring attention. I had thought about 9 years old. I had said yes. Susan Garland had died in March 2021 from primary sclerosing cholangitis that had been complicated by cholangiocarcinoma, bile duct cancer, the specific combination that accelerated what would otherwise have been a slower decline. She was 34 years old. Zoe was 4 years old. I had kept the architectural consulting practice going because the practice was what I knew how to do and because Zoe needed her father doing what he knew how to do. The work, assessing historic buildings for renovation potential and preservation classification, giving clients the honest picture of what a structure was and what it needed, had been the thing that kept me organized in the first years after Susan died. I was good at it. Not famous. Memphis had no famous architectural consultants. But I had the specific reputation of someone who could be trusted to tell you what was actually there rather than what you wanted to hear. This was the reputation that had brought Melissa Harte to my door in August 2024, or rather had brought me to her door, which was the door of a 1924 commercial building in the South Main Arts District that she had purchased in 2022 and that she wanted a complete assessment of before undertaking a significant renovation. I had started the assessment the first week of August. Melissa ran a data analytics firm. She had 32 employees in the building's upper 2 floors and used the ground floor for client meetings and events. She was present but not intrusive. She had the quality of a CEO who understood that specialists needed space to do their work and who provided it without requiring constant updates. I had met Connor in the 3rd week of August. He was dropped off at the building on Tuesdays after school. Melissa had told me he came to the office on Tuesdays because Tuesday was the day she stayed late, and it was easier for Connor to come to her than for her to rearrange her schedule. He had a designated corner of the open plan office with a desk and a lamp and a clear understanding from the staff that he was not to be disturbed. I had been examining the building's ground floor structural supports when he had come in the 3rd Tuesday. He had looked at me. He had said, "Are you the building guy?" I had said, "I'm one of the building guys." He had said, "What are you looking for?" I had said, "Signs that the building is healthy, evidence that it's been taken care of, and the places where it hasn't been taken care of, so we can understand what it needs." He had thought about this. He had said, "Is it?" I had said, "Healthy? Mostly. There are a few places that need attention." He had nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He had gone to his corner and opened his homework. The following Tuesday, he had asked me 3 questions about load-bearing walls. He had clearly been thinking about our conversation for a week. The questions were specific and showed that he had looked something up, which was the quality of a child who was genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity. I had answered the questions in full. He had written down my answers in his notebook. Melissa had called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week of August. The office was on the 2nd floor, a corner space with the specific quality of a workspace that belonged to someone who was serious about the work, not decorated for effect. A large desk, monitors, reference books, a whiteboard with the kind of notation that meant something to someone who worked in data analytics. A single framed photograph on the bookshelf. Connor at a baseball game, 8 years old, mid-swing, the specific concentrated quality of a child doing something he loved. She had explained the situation with the direct efficiency of someone who was accustomed to presenting complex information clearly. The custody case, Brad's argument about her work schedule and domestic stability, Robert Ames's observation, the hearing date. She had said, "I need to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm not asking you to testify to anything that isn't true. I'm asking you to attend several events with Connor and me over the next 6 weeks. Events where people who know Connor will observe a consistent, stable adult male presence in our household. The observation will be true. The context will not be as simple as it appears, but nothing you do will be false." I had said, "You're asking me to create a genuine impression through genuine actions." She had said, "Yes." I had said, "What makes you think I'm the right person for this?" She had said, "I've watched you work for 3 weeks. You're patient. You're consistent. You don't perform things you don't mean. Those are the qualities this requires." I had said I needed to think about it. She had said she understood. I had thought about it for 2 days. I had thought about the 9-year-old in the waiting room. I had thought about Connor with his notebook and his questions about load-bearing walls. I had thought about Zoe, who was 8 years old and who had been managing the specific loss of a mother since she was 4, and who had the specific quality of a child who was resilient in a way that was not entirely comfortable to observe. I had said yes. The 6 weeks were the specific ordinary texture of a decision that you cannot fully understand at the time you make it. I attended Connor's baseball games on Saturday mornings, the Little League field off Germantown Road, the Memphis Redbirds jersey Connor wore even though Little League had its own jerseys, the specific energy of a 9-year-old who played baseball the way he did everything else, which was with complete attention and significant opinions. He was good, not exceptional. 9-year-olds in Little League covered a wide range, and Connor was in the solid, reliable middle of it, but attentive in a way that mattered more than natural ability at 9 years old. He knew his stats, he knew his teammates' stats, he knew the opposing team's stats, which was something that not all 9-year-olds committed to. I knew baseball, not from playing. I had been a reader rather than an athlete, which my father had accepted without apparent disappointment, one of the things I gave him credit for. But I had followed baseball the way people who grew up in baseball cities followed it, which was as part of the background noise of the place, and I could hold up my end of a conversation about ERA and batting average and the specific tendencies of left-handed batters against right-handed pitchers, which Connor had opinions about with a capital O. He had explained these opinions to me at the second baseball game, not because I had asked, because he had decided I was worth explaining them to. This was how Connor operated, I came to understand. He sorted people into categories, worth explaining to, not worth explaining to, and the sorting happened quickly and was not easily revised. I had been sorted into the first category somewhere between the load-bearing wall conversation and the second baseball game, and I understood this as something that had been given rather than earned, and that carried the specific weight of something given by a child. Melissa had been on the bleachers beside me at those games. We had talked the way two people talked when they were watching something together, easily, about what was in front of them and about other things, the specific way of conversation that happened when you were not performing conversation, but simply being in the same place with someone and talking. She had the quality of someone who was interesting to talk to, not in the way of someone who had decided to be interesting, in the way of someone who had real opinions about things that mattered and who was not performing her opinions but simply having them. I had noticed this in the first week of the assessment. I had been noticing it for 10 weeks. Zoe had come to the 3rd and 5th baseball games. She and Connor were 1 year apart and had arrived at each other with the specific assessment that children made when they were placed in proximity at an event and told to interact. They had negotiated a comfortable arrangement by the 3rd game. Zoe pretended not to care about baseball, and Connor explained it to her anyway because Connor could not be in the presence of baseball without explaining it to someone, and Zoe was the available someone. I had watched my daughter listen to Connor explain the infield fly rule with the focused patience of a child who was genuinely interested, but who had decided that showing interest would undermine her negotiating position. She was so much like Susan that it occasionally made it difficult to look at her. I had said this to Melissa at the 5th game, not as a complaint, as an observation, the specific honest thing that sometimes came out of me when I was comfortable enough with someone to say the things I did not normally say. Melissa had said, "Is it hard?" I had said, "It's also the best thing. She's exactly like Susan in the ways that mattered most about Susan." Melissa had said, "What ways?" I had said, "She pays attention to the right things." Susan could walk into a room and know within 30 seconds what the room needed, not in a social management way, in a genuine attention way. She noticed what was actually there. Melissa had said, "Zoe does that." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "So does Connor." I had looked at Connor explaining the infield fly rule to Zoe with the specific intensity of someone who needed this information to be correctly received and transmitted. I had said, "Yes, he does." In the 5th week, Connor had asked me if I liked his mother. We had been in the parking lot after the baseball game. Melissa was talking to another parent. Zoe had gone back to my truck for her book. Connor and I were standing by the bleachers in the October afternoon with the specific quality of a Memphis October that was gentler than the summer that had preceded it. He said, "Do you like my mom?" I said, "Yes." He said, "As a friend or the other kind?" I said, "What makes you ask?" He said, "Because I've watched. You listen to her differently than you listen to other people." I looked at him. He was 9 years old and he had Memphis Redbirds dirt on his jersey from the game and his notebook in his back pocket, and he was looking at me with the specific direct quality of a child who asks what he wants to know and expects an honest answer. I said, "I think your mother is a remarkable person." He said, "I know." He thought for a moment. "She works too much, but that's because she cares about things." I said, "Yes, that's exactly it." He said, "Do you care about things?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I can tell." He looked at the baseball field. "My dad cares about things too, but they're different things." I did not respond to that. It was not my place to respond to that. He said, "You don't have to answer the question if you don't want to." I said, "About whether I like your mother?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I'm working on finding the right time to tell her." He looked at me with the specific expression of a 9-year-old who had understood more than he was supposed to understand. He said, "Okay." He went to find his cleats. I want to tell you what Connor told Judge Gould, because it is the center of this story and because the specific things a 9-year-old says to a judge about a man he has known for 10 weeks tell you something about what 10 weeks of paying attention actually contains. Judge Patricia Gould had been presiding over family court cases in Shelby County for 14 years. She had heard thousands of custody cases. She had spoken privately with hundreds of children in contested custody proceedings. She had, over 14 years, developed the specific patience of someone who had spent a long time watching families navigate the legal system's approximation of what was best for their children, and who understood that the children's voices were frequently the most precise information available. She had asked Connor to tell her about his home, his school, his life. He had done so. He had said he wanted to live with his mother. He had said the things you expected. She was the one who came to his games. She was the one who knew his teachers' names. She was the one who knew what he was reading and what he wanted to be when he grew up. Then he had said, "I want Nick to be my dad. For real. Not just for school stuff." She had asked him to tell her about Nick. He had told her. He had told her that Nick came to the baseball games and knew the stats and did not have his phone out the whole time. He had told her that Nick listened when Connor talked about baseball in a way that meant he was actually listening and not just waiting for Connor to finish. He had told her that Nick had fixed the loose handle on his bat without being asked, had noticed it was loose and had produced a screwdriver from his truck and had fixed it between innings without making a production of it. He had told her that Nick treated his mother like she was interesting. He had said his grandfather had treated his grandmother this way. He had said he thought this was the right way to treat someone. He had told her that Nick had a daughter named Zoe who was 8 years old and who was good at baseball even though she pretended not to like it. He had told her that Nick made Zoe's lunch every day even though Zoe was old enough to make her own. Judge Gould had asked how he knew this. Connor had said Zoe had told him at the baseball game. He said Zoe had said her dad always made her lunch and she had asked him why, and he had said the making of the lunch was not about the lunch. Judge Gould had asked Connor what he thought that meant. Connor had thought about it for a moment. He had said, "It means he pays attention to the right things." Melissa told me this on the phone on Thursday morning. I had been quiet for a long time after she told me. She said, "Nick." I said, "I didn't know he knew that." She said, "He asked Zoe at the third game. He asked her things about you." I said, "He was researching me." She said, "He was deciding." I said, "Yes." She said, "He decided in your favor." I said, "I know." I looked at the cold coffee on my desk. "What did the judge do?" She said, "She awarded primary custody to me." She noted Connor's expressed preference and the evidence of domestic stability. She noted the consistent presence of a stable adult male figure in the household over the preceding weeks. A pause. Her language was careful. She didn't comment on the nature of the arrangement. I said, "She knew." Melissa said, "She knew something. Judges in family court know a great deal." I said, "And Connor didn't know he was telling her something complicated." She said, "He knew exactly what he was saying. He's 9, not naive." I thought about this. I thought about Connor in the parking lot in October. I can tell. The specific direct quality of a child who sorts people into categories and who had sorted me and who had apparently, in the weeks since, been building a case. I said, "He fixed it." She said, "He tried to." I said, "No, he fixed it. You got primary custody." She said, "Yes." I said, he said what he wanted. He said the true thing. And it worked. She said, not because it worked, because it was true. I said, yes, that's better. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Nick, what do we do now? I had thought about this for 2 days. Not consciously, but the way you thought about things that were too large for conscious thinking, that settled into the background of everything else and that organized themselves while you were doing other things. I said, Connor has a baseball game on Saturday. She said, yes. I said, I'd like to come. She said, not for the arrangement. I said, not for the arrangement. She was quiet again. She said, Zoe. I said, she'll want to come. She'll pretend she doesn't care about the baseball. Melissa said something that might have been a laugh, the specific quality of a sound that was not entirely composed. She said, okay. I said, Melissa. She said, yes. I said, the thing Connor told the judge about the lunch. She said, yes. I said, I started making Zoe's lunch when Susan died because Zoe was 4 and couldn't make her own. I kept doing it after she could because, I don't know, because the morning routine was ours, because I wanted her to start the day knowing that someone had thought about her. She said, that's what Connor told the judge. I said, in his version. She said, his version was? It means he pays attention to the right things. I said, he's a good kid. She said, yes, he is. I said, he got that from somewhere. She did not say anything. I said, Saturday. She said, Saturday. I drove home from the office at 6. Zoe was at the kitchen table with her homework, the specific scene of a Tuesday evening that had been the scene of every Tuesday evening for 3 years, which was Zoe at the table and the homework getting done before anything else, which was a habit she had developed herself, which was one of the many things she had developed herself that reminded me of Susan. She looked up when I came in. She said, how is the building? I said, the building is good. I'm almost done with the assessment. She said, is Mrs. Harte going to do the renovation? I said, I think so. The building can handle it. She went back to her homework. I made dinner. The specific Tuesday routine of pasta and salad, the routine that had been the routine since Zoe was old enough to have preferences and had expressed a preference for pasta on Tuesdays, which had somehow become the permanent Tuesday arrangement. While I was making dinner, she said, from the table, Dad. I said, yeah. She said, Connor told me something. I said, when? She said, at the last game. He said he told the judge he wants you to be his dad. I set down the spoon. She was still looking at her homework, not avoiding my eyes, reading. She had Susan's quality of saying the significant thing while doing something else, which removed the performed weight from the saying of it. I said, I heard. She said, is that okay? I said, with me? She said, with everything. I looked at my daughter, 8 years old, at the kitchen table, with her homework in front of her and her mother's quality of attention in everything she did. I said, what do you think? She said, I think Connor is good at knowing things. I said, yes. She said, I think you like his mom. I said, yes. She said, I think that's okay. She went back to her homework. I went back to the pasta. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way of a kitchen that had been used for 3 years of Tuesday evenings and that held all of them in its particular accumulated warmth. I thought about Connor with his notebook in the corner of the open-plan office. Connor explaining the infield fly rule to Zoe with the focused patience of someone who needed the information to be correctly received. Connor in the parking lot in October, direct and 9 years old and knowing what he knew. I thought about a judge in Shelby County Family Court asking a 9-year-old what he thought it meant that someone made his daughter's lunch every day even though she was old enough to make her own. And the 9-year-old saying, it means he pays attention to the right things. The pasta was ready. I made Zoe's plate. I put it on the table in front of her. She said, thanks, Dad. I said, that's what I do. She looked at the plate. She looked at me. She said, I know. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a child in your life, your own or someone else's, who saw something clearly that the adults around them were managing not to see? Who said the true thing because they didn't have a reason not to? Children do that sometimes. They pay attention to the right things and they say what they see. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.